Today I'd like to welcome Dr. Nathan Gossett and our winning math modeling team from an international contest. Michael Tetzlaff, Tony Burand, and Jake Smith. They're going to talk about their experience in the 2013 math modeling contest and talk about baking brownie.
So most of this presentation is going to be handled by the students who competed in it, but I was the faculty advisor for the team, and I was just going to give a brief introduction for what the contest was. So first of all, this was the COMAP mathematical contest in modeling. And a lot of times people hear math modeling and they think there's some sort of calendar involved or something like that. That's not exactly what math modeling is. What math modeling is basically we're using math to try and model some real life phenomenon. So we want to identify what things go into changing the outcome, and then once we've identified all those things, we try and use math to predict what the outcome is going to be. So as a quick example, if you are from the physics department or you've taken a calculus class at some point, you've probably done the falling object problem, where if I drop an object and I want to know based on how long it's been falling, where is it now? We have a pretty simple mathematical model for that. So if we know how strong gravity is and we know how long the object's been falling, we can now predict where that object has gotten to. And so we've constructed a model, which is that formula there. We identify values for each parameter. So those of you who've taken physics recently, how strong is gravity where we are right now? There we go. So, and then we know if we know how long that object's been falling, we plug those values in, and we now have a prediction for where that object is. If we were on the moon, we would have to change how strong gravity is, but we could still do that calculation. Now, we can predict the outcome. The more terms we add to this, we can start adding wind resistance, we can add other things. We can start making this more and more complicated, and that should make it more and more accurate. But at a certain point, we kind of have to say, well, this is about as complicated as we can handle right now. Let's run with what we have and use that to predict. So, every year there's this 96-hour-long competition that they're going to be telling you about. To give you an idea of where this fits in with the context, there were 5,600 some teams that entered from 14 different countries this year. 55% of them were eliminated in the first round of triage judging. 1,650 were given an honorable mention. 857 were given a meritorious ranking. And then out of the 24 teams that were left, 13 were named finalists, and then 11 of them were named the outstanding winner teams, of which Bethel was one of them. And on top of that, Bethel was also awarded the Mathematical Association of America Prize for 2013 for their favorite paper. So to give you an idea of where Bethel sits on this, the online records only go back to 2000, but going back to 2000, there's 65 schools from around the world that have won at least one outstanding paper designation. Bethel has now won 4 since we started competing in 2001. That ties us with MIT during that time period, the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. We're coming up on Harvard. We have a couple more wins to pull even with them, but this is a big deal. So we're very proud of our teams for doing this. Okay, so one point that I'd like to say, I see there's a couple faculty in the audience. I'd like to point out we did not actually change our department's curriculum to match this competition. Some schools might, we didn't. The reason why Bethel does well at this is that the same thing that was driving the need for the contest is what drives our curriculum. So there's this need for math modeling. This is a good job skill to have, so we built that into our curriculum, and that was also the reason why they created this contest, is they wanted to encourage students to get into math modeling. So because our curriculum is being driven by that, we do well at this contest. So if your department, if you're from another department, if your department doesn't participate in any competitions right now, I would encourage you to look for a competition that matches what your department already does well. And get Bethel out there. Get your students, if you are a student, encourage your professors to find one of these competitions. In 2001, when I was a student, Bill Kinney basically just said, hey, you feel like doing a math modeling competition? And I didn't know what it was, but I said, sure. And here we are. So at this point, I'd like to hand it off to Michael. And
all right.
Well, so I'm going to talk just a little bit about how the contest actually works. So there's usually, you have almost always have two problems to choose from. One of them is usually going to be a continuous problem, so this would appeal to someone who is maybe a physics major or likes calculus and stuff like that. And so an example of this type of problem would be building an optimal half pipe ramp for a snowboarder to optimize the amount of airtime. So this was actually a problem we had 2 years ago on the team that I was on. And so that's an example of a continuous problem. The other type of problem is a discrete problem, and that would appeal to someone who is going into operations research or computer science, and it's more logistical in nature. Like the problem we had last year was to schedule river rafting trips down a river. The trips are multiple days long, and you need to utilize the campsites most efficiently. So those are the two general types of problems. Those are examples, but the main thing is there's continuous versus discrete. And then the other thing is that problems can be very specific or very general. Sometimes they'll give you some variables to work with. They'll say, you have these variables, you have these constants, maximize this parameter. Other times, it's just very general. They'll say, like, solve some problem, like solve the water crisis in Egypt or something like that. And so there's quite a spectrum there. The specific problems tend to involve a little bit heavier math, whereas the general problems tend to involve a little bit more research, although usually both of them involve quite a bit of both. The contest itself is 96 hours long, 4 days. It begins Thursday at 7 p.m. That's when we get the problem. And then on Monday at 7 p.m. is when they stop accepting electronic submissions for the contest. And you can use any non-human resource for the competition, so you can use all your textbooks, you can use the internet, you can write your own computer program in Java or Mathematica or MATLAB, but you cannot talk with anyone about the competition. So for instance, we couldn't even talk to Dr. Gossett, our coach for the contest, even though we could talk to him about logistics, like can you get us, I don't know, he brought us some brownies one day. But we couldn't bounce ideas off of him regarding the math for the project. You also can't talk with friends about the competition or the other Bethel teams, and you can't post anything online about the competition. And a few other things. Professors usually gave us permission to miss most of our classes. I think we went to a few of them that we just thought would be we'd get behind if we missed 2 days, but for the most part we didn't go to classes. And then we had a room that was our home base for the competition, where we could just work on it without distractions, and just work as a team and get the problem solved. And so there's a picture of us in our room at the beginning of the competition. The paper itself is written using the typesetter LaTeX. I know some of you probably have used it before. It's kind of like Microsoft Word, but it's a lot better for doing equations, and it gives you a lot more control. You actually write out the formatting code rather than just having Microsoft Word, do it automatically. And then the paper always starts with a summary sheet, which is kind of like an abstract if you've ever written a formal paper before. But it can be longer. It can be up to a full sheet, and that's all the judges will read in some of the early rounds of judging. So you want to make sure the summary sheet is really good. And then there's always a real-life advertisement or pitch. So that's where you're supposed to explain what your solution was to someone who isn't, mathematical, but who might work in the field. So, like for instance, this year was an advertisement to the editor of like a chef's magazine, saying why they should use our Brownie pans over, someone else's. And then beyond that, there's the paper format. You're supposed to restate and clarify the problem, so that's just where you would say, what angle are you approaching it at? There's often multiple ways to approach a problem. Then you list the assumptions you have and justify them, so you can't, solve the problem without making assumptions. They're just too broad. And so you have to simplify the problem a little bit by making some assumptions, but you need to justify them and then figure out, what effect those assumptions are going to have. Then you have your model design, which is the meat where you write out all your equations. You put in, some of the source code and explain, how you came up with that. Then you'll have your model testing and sensitivity analysis, which is basically where you put your results. You run the program, you get your results, And then the sensitivity analysis is very important, and so that's where you actually see if your assumptions were slightly different, like let's say gravity was 9.5 instead of 9.8, how would that affect your results? And so you do that and you can kind of create some error bounds to see how much of an effect those assumptions have in your model. And then finally, strengths and weaknesses. You emphasize what you did right. And then the weaknesses, you're always going to, in 96 hours, your paper's not going to be perfect. Our paper had a number of weaknesses, but you just, state what those are, and then you say, if we had more than 96 hours, what would we have done differently? So now, Tony is going to talk a little bit about how our team specifically approached the contest.
All right, so I'm going to kind of go over the flow of how the competition went over the 4 days that we competed. And kind of first off, before the competition started, there was some preparatory work that went into getting ready for this. And for me in particular, since I had never done this competition before, I did a lot of reading over the rules and stuff for the competition and what exactly it entailed. And then also looking over their suggestions by various professors in the U.S. about how exactly teams should approach the competition and kind of what the deadlines for getting particular parts of the project done are. And so one of the interesting things I found, several professors had suggested that the students pull a couple all-nighters at the beginning of the competition just so that they have enough time to do their solution well, and I'll kind of talk about that later in the different approach that we took over the competition. But then kind of the next step was meeting as a group to get kind of a plan out of what we wanted to get accomplished each of the days. And so in particular we looked at, okay, when do we want to have our model done by, when do we want to start writing the paper by, and kind of those type of logistics. And then getting into kind of the paper itself. From last year, Jake and Michael had kind of the template and stuff that we needed to use for the contest. And so it was nice to be able to look over that and kind of see how a paper should be formatted, as well as being able to have those sections already formatted in LaTeX so we could just put in our new text and stuff for this year's competition. But then kind of after that was getting the room set up, and then we were basically waiting for the problem to come out. Because the problem, they come out online, so at 7 o'clock on Thursday, the problem was put up online, and that's when we were able to access it. So Thursday evening, we got the problem. As Michael had stated, there's two different problems you can choose from. We ended up choosing the problem where we had to design a thermally and spatially efficient brownie pan, given certain parameters for dimensions of the oven as well as dimensions of the pan. And we had a weighting factor that we varied, which basically was a linear combination of those two factors. So you could weight it more towards wanting a more spatially efficient pan versus a more thermally efficient pan. And so that's kind of what we were dealing with there. And also Thursday night, we decided to start researching into the problem. So we had to look up kind of all our thermodynamic equations and start figuring out what type of model we wanted to use. And then into Friday then, we started coding, and in this case we ended up splitting up the coding, so I did a fair amount of work on the spatial efficiency coding, and Michael did a lot of work on the thermal modeling, and then Jake was kind of in between both of us, helping us out with debugging and problem solving. And so Friday as well, we ended up having to kind of solidify the assumptions that we were going to use for the competition, so that we could simplify the problem down to where it was solvable. And then at kind of the end, then of Friday, we found out that in our thermodynamics model, we were running into some issues with, we didn't know exactly what different properties Brownie mix had, so we had to do some experiments then Saturday, which I'll talk about in a minute, to get our model working. So the big question then is, what are the material properties of brownies? So the ones we looked at in particular were specific heat, density, thermal conductivity, and the thermal expansion coefficient. And for these, we used kind of two different setups to be able to measure these properties. And so kind of the first one was using thermocouples, where we actually stuck thermocouples into brownie mix as we were baking it, so we could measure kind of the heating and the heat distribution throughout the whole pan as we cooked them. And then we're able to get the thermal expansion coefficients, and we are also able to calculate density changes in the brownie mix. And then kind of the other interesting one that kind of comes from my chemistry background was calorimetry, to get specific heat of the brownie mix. So basically, after we had baked it, we took just a chunk of the brownie, and we used a calorimeter here. It's this guy. And you basically put the hot chunk of brownie into the water here, and then the thermal energy from the brownie goes into the water to heat the water. And then from that, you can measure the temperature difference and get the specific heat then of the brownie mix. So that was probably one of the funner things that we tried in this competition. So we had plenty of food then to kind of sustain us through the competition, as well as being able to share it with some other people in the dorms. So then into Sunday, as you can see, we were able to watch the Super Bowl, which was a plus. We did end up working on a project and stuff in between on commercials, but kind of the main point here that I want to bring up is that we ended up deciding that it would be better for us to take more breaks rather than just work completely through the day and then through parts of the night, just so we wouldn't get burned out over the competition. And that seemed to work really well, just to kind of get your mind off the competition for a little bit, and just have that time where you can get back into the competition after a little bit of a break. And then on Saturday, we ended up finishing up our sensitivity analysis, so this was kind of the big day, the push to finish all the models and then start writing the paper. And so we really tried to get writing on the paper kind of that afternoon and into the evening, so that we could have Monday then to do revisions and edits of the paper, as well as kind of get our real poster and stuff together, so that we could get that all set for submission. And then kind of on Monday then as well, we had a few bugs that we had to work out in the code, but nothing too significant, which was nice. And then we were able to finish up that paper and get it submitted by before 7 on Monday night. So now I'm going to turn this over to Jake, and he's going to talk about kind of what our solution actually was and kind of how we approached that.
So, something Tony failed to mention is that as we were submitting our paper, we actually missed one of the regulations that we needed to perform in order for them to actually accept us in the grading. And so we almost lost this whole competition just because we failed to put our team number on one of the pages we were supposed to submit electronically. The funny thing is that we also failed to do this last year. So we didn't really learn from our mistakes. But anyway, I'm here to talk about the solution to our problem. for those of you who are dozing off or doing crosswords, whoever they may be. We're trying to design the best brownie pan given the area of an, or given a fixed area of an oven. And the key thing is it has to be a rectangular oven, so you can't have these crazy circular ones or quadra ellipse, which is just like a rectangle but an oval, you know, something like that. Anyway, it's a square oven, and that's key for when we were doing this competition. So as defining best for brownie pan, we have to talk about how evenly it heats the brownie around the edges and how efficiently it uses space inside the oven. So before we can begin even discussing these types of problems, we had to decide what shapes we were going to pursue for our brownie. We decided that regular polygons would probably be the easiest just because they're symmetrical and because they don't get too crazy. They're convex shapes, which means you can't have like this weird loop thing going around. They're just really nice shapes, so we decided to stick with them. Furthermore, we can narrow down our search by eliminating all odd-sided polygon shapes. For example, any odd-sided polygon shape inside a rectangular container will not be as efficient as spacing as any of its even counterparts. It's because it has extra corners that kind of jut out and they don't pack symmetrically or easily. Also, any odd-sided polygon will not heat as efficiently as its next biggest even-sided counterpart. And that's because it has more corners. The even-sided has more corners, and therefore the edges will be more efficient in the heating. So we have just eliminated a lot of shapes, and we can get down to just even-sided shapes and the circle. So this brings us to our spacing algorithm. As you can see, we have one main design, and that is the lattice structure as depicted by all these stop signs. Basically, it's a lattice, and it's you just have this grid pattern where you put one right next to it, put one above, and so on and so forth. Makes a pattern like this. Fits really nice inside a rectangular container. So that was one of our packing algorithms, and it actually is most of the packing except for one case, and that is the hexagon. The hexagon is a special shape because it can do something we call tessellation, which is form a pattern like you see right here. And admittedly, we got this idea from the popular board game Settlers of Catan. I don't know if you guys have played that, but that's where we got the idea for this pattern. And so the hexagon actually had two choices. It could either have a lattice design or this tessellation pattern, whichever is more efficient. And these pictures are also nice because they describe not only how it packs, but you can see that the shapes aren't all quite together. There's these little gaps in between. When you're actually baking brownies, you aren't going to put the pans right next to each other, especially if you're doing multiple racks, because then that'll disrupt like the convection currents. And so the brownies won't heat as nicely. So you have to take into account this space in order for your overall model to work. So from there, we decided that how to measure efficiency for a specific packing algorithm is to use how much space we actually use divided by the total space. That ratio would determine how efficient we were in a packing for a particular shape. So now onto the heating algorithm. We can first we have to decide how heat transfers, and that's based off Newton's law of cooling right here. And then we can plug in our physical constants that we determined in our baking brownie experiment, many people here have actually eaten the brownies from that experiment. So thank you for coming to support us. After plugging in those constants, we can come up with this equation where we put that into Mathematica, which is our modeling program. And we can get some outputs of temperature around the edge of a pan after a certain time. So we would let our virtual brownies bake for about 30 minutes, and then we could see how hot they were at the end of that time. And we decided that a good way, though, if we had more time, we could probably devise a better way to determine efficiency for an actual heating algorithm, is to have the ratio between the coolest temperature on the edge to the hottest temperature on the edge. That way you can see the difference of like heating on there for a brownie. And it all depended on how many corners the shape had. So like a circle has infinite corners. It's going to be perfect efficiency just by definition. Whereas a square, like the corners would get a lot more crisp since they're next to a lot more area heating up. So, and that was actually one of our biggest challenges, was to determine how much should an actual corner heat up the brownie. That was a big question. Actually, we had a typo on our paper about that equation, but that's okay. The judges didn't seem to care. But yeah, so what we did, the actual heating algorithm is pretty complicated, but basically we broke the brownie up into little cubes. And as the pan would heat up these little cubes, the cubes would in turn heat up more cubes closer to the inside of the brownie, and those cubes would heat up more cubes, and so on and so forth. And that's how you got like an actual temperature reading around the pan. And that's how our heating algorithm worked. And from all that, we could collect a bunch of data, and we did collect a bunch of data, and made a least squares fit to that data so that we could predict the ratio of efficiency for any shape of any regular polygon for any number of sides. So combining these two algorithms together, we arrive at the best pan. Surprise, there is no best pan. That's what we determined. There's no best pan for any single oven size. We need three things to determine the best pan for a given customer. First, we need the area of the pan. How many brownies do we want to make out of one pan? We need the area of the oven that these brownies are going into. And we need to know how much our customer actually cares about perfect heating as opposed to space efficiency. If they just want to bake as many brownies as they can, then they won't care about how good the brownies are. But if they just want the perfect brownies, and that's what matters, then we'll have to decide what the best pan is for them. So with these three things, we can decide the best pan for anybody. So after collecting our data and running through our model, we were able to come up with this fantastic chart, which we have a set oven size. Then we vary the shapes of the pans along with the sizes of the pans, and we vary this P ratio for how much they care about heating to how much they care about spacing, and the results are as shown. The circle usually wins out. You can see a lot of wins here, but we also notice that the square and the hexagon also do a good job of being efficient overall. And so we decided that, hey, this is that one shape is pretty dominant over the others, but it doesn't win out all the time. If we really want to give our customer the best pan, we'd have to have them tell us what they want. And in order to do that, we need these three things: that, area pans, area oven. So if we were to inform our brownie baking bosses what sort of pan our company should design, we should tell them to get input from the customers for what they want. Otherwise, the customers will be losing out in efficiency. And so that is our solution. Thank you.
So we have a few minutes for questions. I also want to put in a little plug. This is a contest that's sponsored by the math department, but these guys are all double majors. So all three of them are double majors in physics, which was obviously key to this contest. Tony's also a double major in chemistry. Is that right? Yeah. So, which was again a help for the contest. So we love being able to put together a team full of people with a wide variety of skills. So just because you're not necessarily a 100% math major doesn't mean that you can't participate in this contest. So next year when we're starting to recruit again, please keep that in mind. Otherwise, does anyone have any questions for the team?
So what are the other majors for these days?
Oh, so Jake, you're also a math, and Michael is also a computer science.
This is an international competition, right? Yes. So since you've tackled brownies, do you have a cultural advantage?
That is probably the case. But then again, there was the water efficiency program like we have to solve a water crisis in Egypt. So teams from Egypt might have an advantage there. Also, there are other countries like China, and I think even Russia was on there. So countries from those teams might have an advantage. But yes, I do believe that having brownies so readily available and having eaten so many myself, gave us a pretty nice advantage.
The other thing is, I think that it mentioned brownies in the name of the problem, but the problem itself didn't actually mention brownies. So you could, have some other food that you cook in a pan like that, if that was easier. But
Do you have a way of verifying your results externally? Like if you go to a nice chef store, cooking store, they have circular brownie pans.
yeah, well, we did find one paper that we were able to verify some of our coefficients. So we were able to verify that, and then I don't know, the problem kind of started out with the assumption that the circles and squares are best for the two extremes, and so it kind of makes sense that a hexagon or an octagon would kind of split the difference if you wanted a little bit of both. So I think, and we did find some pictures of hexagon pans and some. So I mean, they do exist. So I mean, there's people that use them. So it's not. Yeah.
How did you structure the writing of the paper as far as who did what, and would you all proofread each other's writing, or how did you do that? How did you put it together?
Yeah, we mainly focused on what we were doing during the competition. As Tony mentioned, Michael did a lot of the heating algorithm, and Tony did a lot of the spacing algorithm. So they were the bulk writers for that portion of the paper. I did sensitivity analysis, and then after we had all written a first draft of what we did, we each looked over each other's parts, and then after we each looked over each other's parts, we went over it as a team and just made all these edits and thought what would be best and did it that way. So we split up what we did.
Coherence from the start, did you plan?
Well, we always have a plan. Whether we stick to that plan is up for debate. But yeah, we just did what we did and then edited each other.
What was the other choice, and why did you choose the brownie? You already mentioned.
Oh, yeah, it was the water resources, optimizing them for a particular country. Do you want to tell them why we chose the brownie problem?
Sure, I can. So, kind of as Jake said with the other problem, there would be a lot of research we figured going into that. So, like one of the countries is the U.S., and to design a water usage and recycling plan, that would take quite a bit of research to find out kind of how water is being used, what kind of recycling treatment plants do we have and where are they. And so we figured that even though the brownie pan would be a lot more math intensive, we could have a little bit less research to do and kind of start into the problem right away. And since all three of us have a math, physics background and stuff, we felt that would be more suited to our team as a whole.
Is it reasonable to think that a lot of the folks who didn't get even to the honorable mention category is because they committed to a certain type of pan rather than your conclusion?
Well, I can answer that a little bit. The judging is actually very, very harsh for this particular competition. I've judged the high school version of this competition, and I haven't judged the undergraduate version, but I'm told that you have about 60 seconds to make it past that first round. And so if the judges, there's 5,000 some papers, and so if the judges don't see something they like within the first 60 seconds, you stand a very poor chance. And so you might have a brilliant paper, but if they don't right away identify your paper as something they want to read, then unfortunately you get into that first category. And so yeah, I'm sure every year there's some brilliant papers that just unfortunately get ignored, but that's one of the things that we practice for prior to the competition, is making sure that you catch the judge's attention right away and make sure that they know there's something special about your paper.
So how do you do that?
The summary sheet, it's only 1 page or less than 1 page, but we suggest that the team spend an unbalanced amount of time on that summary sheet to make sure that the summary sheet isn't coy. It doesn't say, oh, read our paper to find out what. No, just tell them what interesting things you did, what your results were, and just kind of lay it out right away, and have good subject headings, because they might flip through really quickly, and so you need good figures, good subject headings to make sure that the judges know there's good stuff to read if they go for the details.
How far away are we from having an all-women's team and an all-men's team competing?
This year, as hard as I tried to recruit, none of the women, so I'm looking at Katie here in the front row. In the past, we've had better gender balance. This year, none of them wanted to compete, so.
So how has this newfound celebrity status affected your lives?
Not really. Hasn't changed that much. Still have to go to class.
Where are you guys headed, you know, for graduate school? What areas, schools, does this help you? I would guess it would be a pretty nice kudo on your vita, huh?
Yeah, and I applied to graduate school and got accepted this year, and I did mention the competition last year, which we also finished in the top 10. And so I mentioned that, and you know, just the participation all 3 years, and so I'm like thinking that was a contributing factor to my acceptance at graduate school, and it's definitely good preparation because you know. It is, you know, like you're writing a full-out research paper, even though it's only, you know, 96 hours long. You know, you are, you know, writing a full paper and solving a problem, which, you know, is something you need to do in graduate school. So it is good practice.
And what area are you going into?
I'm going into computer science.
Okay. How about you?
I'm going to actually be here next semester, so
Okay.
I'm going to stick with math though, and that's what I'll be going to, hopefully grad school for.
And I'll be kind of taking a year off and stuff, and gonna be applying for grad school for next fall and stuff. And I'm in engineering.
Thank you.
Okay. Well. Thank you for coming out.